Imagine this. You're a knight. You've trained since childhood, wearing armor worth more than an entire village, riding a horse bred specifically for war. Your nobility, you're invincible. God himself blessed your bloodline. But in exactly 4 hours, you'll be lying face down in the mud with an arrow through your skull, killed by a barefoot Welsh criminal who learned to shoot a bow because it was literally the law. Your armor? Useless. Your training? Meaningless. Your noble blood? Fertilizer. August 26th, 1346. The Battle of Crécy. The day 9,000 exhausted, starving English peasants faced 30,000 of Europe's finest knights and didn't just win, they slaughtered them. 1,500 French nobles dead, princes, dukes, kings. The English? They lost 40 men. Not 400. 40. This wasn't a battle. This was an execution, and it happened because of something so simple, so brutally elegant, that it destroyed 500 years of military tradition in one bloody afternoon. A 6-foot piece of bent wood and some string. Let me paint you the full horror of what happened that day, because this isn't just a battle. This is the moment medieval warfare died screaming. Edward III of England had just invaded France with about 15,000 men, claiming the French throne through his mother. For weeks, he'd been burning his way across Normandy in what they called a chevauchée, basically state-sponsored terrorism designed to prove the French king couldn't protect his own people. Villages burned, crops destroyed, livestock slaughtered. The English weren't trying to conquer, they were trying to humiliate. And it worked. King Philip VI of France was furious. He assembled the largest army Christendom had ever seen. 30,000 to 35,000 men. This wasn't just an army. This was every important noble in France plus allied kings from across Europe. The Holy Roman Empire sent troops. The King of Bohemia came with his entire court. Knights from Majorca, from Flanders, from Luxembourg. It was like medieval Europe's all-star team, and they all wanted one thing: English blood. These French knights were the apex predators of medieval warfare. A fully armored knight on an armored war horse weighed about a ton. They'd been bred and trained for war since they could walk. Their plate armor cost more than a peasant could earn in 3 lifetimes. For 5 centuries, these heavy cavalry charges had decided every major European battle. Infantry existed to be trampled. Archers were annoyances at best. Real war, noble war, was done with swords and lances on horseback, face to face, knight against knight. The French were so confident that nobles were literally arguing over who would get to capture Edward alive for ransom. They weren't planning for war. They were planning for payday. Edward knew he was trapped. Outnumbered 3 to 1, exhausted from weeks of raiding, low on supplies, far from reinforcements. His army was starving. His men were sick. The French had caught him trying to escape to the English-controlled port of Calais. By every measure, he should have been slaughtered. But Edward had something the French didn't respect, something they considered beneath notice. 5,000 Welsh and English longbowmen. Most were peasants. Many were criminals avoiding prison. None were nobles. They'd been practicing with their bows since childhood, not because they wanted to, but because English law literally required it. Every Sunday after church, every English male had to practice archery. It was illegal to play football or other sports if you hadn't done your archery practice. The crown had been breeding an army of archers for generations without even realizing how devastating they'd become. The longbow was deceptively simple, a 6-foot piece of yew wood with a bowstring. No moving parts, nothing fancy. A French crossbow was mechanical, sophisticated, expensive. The longbow looked primitive by comparison, but in trained hands, it was a machine gun. These archers could fire 12 arrows per minute, one arrow every 5 seconds, accurately, at 250 yards. That's 2.5 football fields away. The draw weight was so insane, 150 to 180 pounds of pull strength, that modern archaeologists can identify longbowmen skeletons by their deformities. Their left arms were inches longer than their right, from years of holding that massive draw weight. Their spines were curved. Their shoulder bones were enlarged and warped. These men had literally reshaped their own skeletons to become weapons. When Edward found a good position near the village of Crécy, he did something brilliant. He positioned his army on a hill, forcing the French to attack uphill. He arranged his men in 3 divisions, with archers forming a V shape between them, creating overlapping fields of fire. Every French knight who charged would have arrows hitting them from 2 directions simultaneously. Then Edward did something that shocked everyone. He ordered his knights to dismount and fight on foot. English nobles, descendants of William the Conqueror, fighting like common infantry. It was unthinkable. It was insulting to everything knighthood represented. But Edward understood what was coming. He was ending one era of warfare and beginning another, whether his own knights liked it or not. The English spent the night before the battle preparing. Archers rubbed beeswax into their bowstrings to waterproof them. Stakes were hammered into the ground at angles to impale charging horses. Ditches were dug to break cavalry formations. Edward even distributed meat and ale, so his men would fight on full stomachs. Every detail was planned. Meanwhile, the French army was chaos. They'd force-marched for hours and arrived exhausted around 4 p.m. Nobles in gleaming armor rode past each other, arguing about who would lead the charge, who would capture Edward, who would get the glory. Some were already counting their ransom money. King Philip actually ordered his army to rest and attack the next morning. But French nobles don't do patience. They saw the English on that hill, outnumbered, trapped, exhausted, and they smelled glory. The king lost control of his own army before the battle even started. Then the sky opened up. A sudden rainstorm soaked the battlefield. The French laughed, confident their plate armor would protect them. But that rain meant life or death for missile troops. The English calmly unstrung their longbows and tucked the strings under their helmets and clothes, keeping them dry. The Genoese crossbowmen had no such option. Their strings absorbed water, stretched, became nearly useless. A tiny detail, a few minutes of preparation, would decide the fate of thousands. When the rain stopped, some French nobles had already started forward. Others followed, not wanting to miss the glory. The king's commands were ignored. What should have been a coordinated assault became an aristocratic mob charging to its death. First came the Genoese crossbowmen, 5,000 of the best mercenaries money could buy. But there was a problem. Their pavises, the large shields they hid behind while reloading, were still with the baggage train miles away. They'd have to advance completely exposed. Plus, their wet bowstrings had reduced their range by half. The Genoese advanced to about 150 yards and fired. Most bolts fell short or hit weakly. Then the English responded. 5,000 longbows released simultaneously. Witnesses said it sounded like thunder. The sky literally darkened. Each archer was putting out 12 arrows per minute. That's 60,000 arrows per minute falling from the sky. The Genoese had no shields. Their crossbows took 30 seconds to reload versus 5 seconds for a longbow, and they were being deleted from existence. They broke and ran, streaming back toward French lines, screaming in Italian, bleeding from 100 wounds. Here's where this story becomes truly insane. The French knights, seeing their own crossbowmen retreating, didn't help them. The Count d'Alençon shouted, "Kill me this rabble that blocks our way." The French knights charged into their own mercenaries, trampling them, cutting them down with swords. They murdered their own soldiers for the crime of not dying fast enough. The Genoese were caught between English arrows from the front and French swords from behind. Thousands died in minutes, killed by both sides. Those who survived fled the battlefield entirely, cursing the French nobles who'd hired them. Now came the main assault, 12,000 mounted knights in full-plate armor, charging uphill through mud over the bodies of dead Genoese, directly into the teeth of 60,000 arrows per minute. This is where we need to understand what a longbow arrow actually did. At long range, arrows might not penetrate good plate armor, but they didn't need to. They hit horses, eyes, mouths, legs, exposed joints. A 1,500-pound warhorse hit by multiple arrows doesn't charge forward. It screams, rears, falls, and becomes a 2,500-pound obstacle. Knights behind crashed into fallen horses. The charge lost all momentum before it even reached English lines. At closer range, under 100 yards, longbow arrows with bodkin points, narrow, hardened steel tips, could punch through mail and even plate armor at weak points. They went through visors into faces, through joints into armpits and groins, through mail into thighs and necks. But even non-penetrating hits were devastating. The impact of an arrow hitting plate armor was like being hit with a hammer. Multiple hits rattled knights inside their armor like dice in a cup. Men stumbled, fell, couldn't get up in the mud. The French came in waves. 16 separate charges over 4 hours. Each wave climbed over the corpses of the previous one. The English archers had pre-supplied arrows stuck in the ground in front of them for quick access. They kept up continuous fire. Contemporary accounts describe arrows falling like snow, so thick that charging knights couldn't see through the storm. The battlefield Edward had prepared now revealed its brilliance. Horses hit the hidden ditches and broke their legs. Knights crashed into sharpened stakes. The mud from the earlier rain turned the slope into a slippery hell, where dismounted knights in 60 pounds of armor could barely move. They became stationary targets, and the archers didn't miss. Here's the detail that captures the absolute horror. English archers ran out of arrows multiple times. You know what they did? They ran forward into the killing field, pulled arrows out of dead and dying French knights, sometimes while those knights were still screaming, and fired them back. The French were being killed with their own recycled suffering. Imagine being a wounded knight, lying in the mud with an arrow through your leg, and watching a peasant archer pull the arrow from your friend's corpse, notch it, and shoot it into your chest. That's not war. That's industrial slaughter. Now the blind King John of Bohemia enters our story with the most insanely suicidal act of nobility in medieval history. John had been blind for a decade, but came to fight anyway because he was the king of Bohemia, and kings don't hide in tents during battles. When he heard the battle was lost, when his advisors begged him to retreat, he allegedly said, "The King of Bohemia does not flee from a battle. I will strike at least one blow today." He ordered his knights to tie their horses' reins to his so they could lead him into combat. This blind, 50-year-old king charged directly into English lines, swinging his sword at sounds and shadows, at the screams of dying men and the thunder of hooves. He and every knight tied to him were killed within seconds, shot full of arrows before they even reached the English infantry. When they found his body the next morning, he was still tied to his dead companions, his blind eyes open to the sky he'd never see, his sword still in his hand. He'd achieved his wish. He'd struck at least one blow before dying. Edward III's son, the Black Prince, was so moved by this display of raw courage that he took John's personal emblem, ostrich feathers, with the motto, "Ich dien," I serve, which remains the symbol of the Prince of Wales to this very day. A blind king's suicidal charge became a symbol of English royalty. That's how powerfully his death resonated, even with his enemies. As the sun set, the French had charged 16 times. 16 separate waves of nobility throwing themselves into the meat grinder, and each charge was less organized than the last. French nobles were fighting each other to reach the front, to have their chance at glory, only to die in the mud like everyone before them. King Philip VI himself charged with the final wave. His horse was killed underneath him. An arrow went through his jaw. His personal bodyguards had to physically drag him from the field while he screamed and struggled, trying to return to battle. The sacred oriflamme, the holy battle banner of France that supposedly guaranteed victory, was abandoned in the mud, trampled by dying horses. As darkness fell, the English couldn't believe they'd won. They stayed in position all night, weapons ready, killing any wounded French who moved. They'd run out of arrows so many times that they'd resorted to using knives, hammers, and sharpened stakes to finish off dismounted knights. English peasant archers were beating French nobles to death with sticks and rocks. The social order of Europe was being murdered in the mud. When dawn broke on August 27th, the scale of slaughter became undeniable. The cream of French nobility lay dead across the slope. The Count of Flanders, the Count of Blois, the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Auxerre, the Count of Sancerre. The list went on and on. 11 princes dead, 1,500 nobles total, thousands of lesser knights. The Genoese who hadn't fled were all dead, many killed by their own French employers. English losses, about 40 dead total, including only 2 knights. 1 English knight killed for every 750 French nobles. The disparity was so extreme that contemporary chroniclers didn't believe it. Some claimed divine intervention, angels fighting for England, God's judgment on French pride. But the reality was simpler and more terrifying. The longbow had made heavy cavalry obsolete in a single afternoon. But it wasn't just the deaths, it was who died. Medieval warfare usually involved capturing nobles for ransom. It was a gentleman's agreement. You didn't kill people worth money. Knights would surrender to other knights, get ransomed, and everyone made profit. But at Crécy, the English archers were common men with no understanding of or care for chivalric codes. They simply killed everyone. They put arrows through the faces of dukes and counts without knowing or caring who they were. No ransoms, no mercy, no prisoners, just death. The psychological impact on European nobility was shattering. For 500 years, being a knight meant being militarily superior. Your noble blood, blessed by God, made you better at war than peasants. Your armor was impenetrable. Your training was supreme. Your courage was unmatched. Crécy proved that a Welsh peasant with a stick could kill you just as dead as another knight. Military superiority didn't come from blood. It came from technology and tactics. The entire social order of medieval Europe, the idea that nobles ruled because they were better warriors, was challenged by peasant archers who'd learned to shoot because it was legally required. The aftermath was grotesque. So many nobles died that there weren't enough people of appropriate rank to bury them properly. You couldn't have a peasant bury a duke. It was beneath a duke's dignity, even in death. Bodies lay rotting for days. Crows and wolves feasted on princely flesh. Contemporary accounts say the crows grew so fat on noble meat that they couldn't fly. They would hop from corpse to corpse, too bloated to take wing. Local peasants looted noble corpses, finding enough wealth in armor and jewelry to transform their miserable lives. The armor that couldn't save its wearers was stripped off, melted down, and sold. A count's breastplate became a peasant's cooking pots. The English army, exhausted and shocked by their own victory, continued their march to Calais. They left behind a field so thick with noble corpses that locals renamed it the Field of the Cloth of Gold, for all the expensive clothing on the dead. For years afterward, farmers plowing would turn up noble bones and rusted armor. France went into shock. The loss of so many nobles in one day created a power vacuum. Entire regions lost their lords. Administrative systems collapsed. Families were wiped out. The French military had to be completely restructured. They started hiring more crossbowmen, building their own archer corps, and most humiliatingly, copying English tactics of fighting on foot. But France didn't learn immediately. 10 years later at Poitiers, they did the exact same thing, charged English archers positioned on a hill with the exact same result. They lost another king, another generation of nobles, thousands more dead. It took the French nearly a century to fully adapt to the reality that peasant archers were more valuable than noble knights. The social implications were even more profound. If peasant archers could destroy noble knights, what did that say about the divine right of nobility? If common Welsh criminals could kill princes, what justified the feudal system? Crécy didn't just kill French nobles. It killed the idea that noble blood meant military superiority. The English longbowman became the most feared soldier in Europe for the next century. But here's the ironic twist. The longbow's dominance was temporary. It required a lifetime of training. You couldn't create longbowmen quickly. You had to start them as children and train them for decades. When gunpowder weapons arrived, weapons any peasant could learn to use in a day, the longbow became obsolete too. The weapon that killed chivalry was itself killed by progress. History has no loyalty. The Count d'Alençon, who ordered the massacre of his own Genoese crossbowmen, was himself shot through the face with an arrow moments later. The French literally killed more of their own men than the English killed Englishmen. The crows that feasted on the battlefield became a legend. Fat, bloated scavenger birds, hopping between corpses because they were too heavy to fly. The perfect metaphor for the death of nobility. Today, a small monument marks the field at Crécy. Tour buses rarely stop. Most people walking past have never heard of what happened there. But on August 26th, 1346, on that muddy slope in northern France, the medieval world ended. 500 years of military tradition, the entire concept of warrior nobility, the romance of knightly combat, all of it died in one afternoon, killed by peasants with bent sticks and string. The English didn't just win a battle at Crécy. They proved that courage couldn't beat mathematics, that nobility couldn't stop arrows, that armor was just expensive metal waiting to become a coffin. The French lost more than nobles that day. They lost their entire understanding of how warfare worked, how society worked, why God had placed them above common men, and all it took was 5,000 peasants who practiced archery every Sunday after church, following a law they probably resented, becoming the most devastating military force Europe had ever seen. The age of the knight was over. The age of the common soldier had begun, and it was written in the blood of 1,500 nobles who charged to their deaths because their pride wouldn't let them believe that peasants could kill princes.